Salams, you're watching the Daily Debrief coming to you from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi with me, Siddhant Dani. And we're coming to you today with a mixture of caution and hope as the World Health Organization has called an end to the global health emergency caused by the COVID-19 virus. The pandemic was experienced by all of us around the world in different ways. We will, of course, not be covering how that went and the response of governments as well as world organizations to it. But instead, we'll be talking to Anna from the People's Health Movement about the future of the World Health Organization and whether we have learned any lessons in how to deal with emergencies of this scale. We'll also be talking about the meeting of the heads of the foreign ministers, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in India, and what these multilateral but also regional organizations mean for a world that is increasingly becoming multipolar in nature. And finally, we'll be looking at a meeting between the heads of government of Japan and South Korea, what the historic significance is of the ties between the two nations, and how these two allies of the United States will play a crucial role in determining the future of the Asian continent and, of course, the world beyond it. First up, as I was saying, the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, after being recommended by the Emergency Committee at its 15th meeting, I believe, has said that the global health emergency caused by the COVID-19 virus and several mutations of it has been ended. This, of course, doesn't mean that the virus has gone away. The virus continues to exist, and governments around the world, health organizations around the world, hospitals, doctors, and other allied healthcare professionals will continue to, as well as people, of course, will have to continue to deal with, treat, and manage this virus as we do other infectious diseases that we live with. We're talking to Anna of PHM today about the hope that Dr. Tedros mentioned in his remarks when calling an end to this pandemic, which at its peak killed as many as 100,000. These are by official estimates. The real numbers, by all accounts, are much, much higher. 100,000 people every week. That number is down to now less than 3,500 per week, but still, it remains important. So we'll be talking to Anna via video conference now about what that hope is, and of course, then leading to more aspects of the functioning of the WHO. Anna, one of, I suppose, the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic was that Dr. Tedros became a household name around the world, something that not many WHO chiefs really have managed to achieve in the recent past. And he said that he's ending or announcing the end to this global emergency with some hope. What is essentially that hope from a global public health perspective from your standpoint today, Anna?
Well, yes. So essentially, until the COVID-19 pandemic or a global health emergency, as the WHO referred to it in technical terms, was announced about 3 years ago, the WHO was not so interesting. And it was actually in 2020 when we saw this resurgence of interest for the WHO, for the things that it does. The members of the WHO all of a sudden remembered that it existed, that it had a function, that it should be funded adequately, that it, that there are some good things that the WHO can bring to the table when we're facing health emergency of this kind. So what Tedros was talking about when he made the announcement, and of course he made the announcement making very clear that this was the end of this technical period that the WHO refers to as a global health emergency. But it's definitely not the end of COVID-19 as an illness, as a disease. COVID-19 is still here. Countries are still expected to treat COVID-19 with interest, to follow what's going on, to make sure that people have adequate access to vaccines, to testing, to other medical supplies that they might need if they get COVID-19. Yeah. So essentially, it's treating COVID-19 as an infectious disease that we've already experienced at other times. So what is important, to note is that when Tedros says that he announces this with great hope, it's also a bit it's a very bittersweet hope, because we know that the official toll of that from COVID-19 stands at 7 million. We know that the actual death toll is much, much higher. That's around 20 million or so, if we take into account the cases that have been unreported, misreported, if we take into account the people who have died of other diseases because they had no access to care when the COVID-19 pandemic was at the peak. So, it's I think that when he talked about hope, he talked also about the lessons that the world had learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. The list of these lessons could be endless if they were actually learned. We have seen very bad examples of big pharma companies monopolizing very important segments of the pandemic response, making huge profits on vaccines, on tests, on oxygen that was left widely unavailable in some parts of the world, essentially in the global south, and most particularly in Africa. So even as we speak of improving data, of improving indicators regarding COVID-19, we still have to face the fact that most of the people in Africa have inadequate access to COVID-19 vaccines still. On the other hand, what should give us hope is that we have seen good examples of how things could work if we wanted them to work that way. And I think that Cuba is one of the examples that we can bring in at all times. The Cuban health system, which was able to respond to the pandemic on its own under blockade, to develop several vaccines on its own, to share those vaccines with others who needed it, and actually show the world how it's possible to function in a way which is based on solidarity and cooperation rather than profit.
Which in many ways was the line that was drawn in what you were sort of trying to sum up. Of course, it was a horrific, tragic time all around the world, and we each experience it in different ways, and it's impossible to kind of go through all of that. But since we are looking forward, Anna, the Health Assembly is scheduled for later in the month. And the functioning of the WHO then, if now like you were saying that members have suddenly realized that there is some value to the work being done here, there is something that the WHO can bring to the table, and at least in terms of sharing what those possible lessons might be, we have enough to go on for the next few years in that sense. So in terms of funding, in terms of functioning, how do you see things going forward in, let's say, the next 5-year period or so?
So, in addition to the announcement of the end of the COVID-19 health emergency ending, we have to consider that so there is the data that actually spurred the emergency committee, which follows COVID-19, to recommend to Director General Tedros to take this step. But then on the other hand, we have all these ongoing discussions taking place at the WHO and outside of the WHO, which will not only deal with how the COVID-19 pandemic has been treated and how COVID-19 will be treated in the future, but also of the standing of the WHO. I think one of those discussions is definitely the pandemic treaty. So we have spoken about the pandemic treaty, a new international instrument mechanism that would supposedly facilitate the world's response to future pandemics, which we know will come. But which still remains a bit unclear. Will this actually function? How will it function? Will it take into consideration all of these inequities that we have spoken here and that also Tedros mentions in his address? So he acknowledges that the COVID-19 response has brought to light very, very serious inequities between regions in the world. What I think remains a bit unaddressed in that announcement is the position of the WHO. And as I mentioned before, of course, it became interesting once again when the COVID-19 pandemic started. But we also cannot lose out of sight the fact that over the decades before, the WHO has been stripped from its power, mainly by international financial institutions like the World Bank, like the IMF, who are grabbing on to this area of global health policy and regulating it in different ways.
Hmm.
There's also the fact that we have so-called philanthropic actors coming in, like the Gates Foundation, who's actually one of the major donors of the WHO. So there are all of these unaddressed problems that the WHO will have to face in the years to come.
Well, so yeah, in that sense, Anna, I think it will be interesting times, and we look forward to having you back on Debrief in the run-up to the Health Assembly, talking about some of those issues more specifically, and also, of course, then reporting on things as they go. But thanks for your time today, and we'll see you very soon. At the end of last week, the foreign ministers of some of the most populous nations in the world, in fact, an organization that represents over 40% of the world's population, including countries like Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and several other Central Asian nations, 8 members in all, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, along with observer nations as well as dialogue partners, participated in a meeting to discuss where the theme essentially was security. It is, of course, a region where there are bilateral differences, there are border disputes, and a series of, or a range of other issues caused by various players who are very much present in the region, including, of course, the United States, whose presence in this part of Asia, Eurasia, as it were, can never be discounted. We'll be joined by Praveer Purkayastha now via video conference to talk more about what exactly the objectives of the SCO are and whether this is a forum that can potentially offer different routes to discuss, negotiate, and come to solutions to regional problems in what is an increasingly, hopefully at least, multipolar world. Prabeer, good to have you with us again on Daily Debrief. A story that we didn't get a chance to cover last week, but are looking at now, India, along with its the rotating presidency of the G20 grouping, also this year is hosting the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the foreign ministers of course, the member states as well as observer countries and dialogue partners have met in the western state of Goa. Aside from the sort of bilateral relations between some of the key members of this organization, Praveer, which we'll get to later, it's another iteration of the importance of these regional and multilateral organizations that create dialogue at different levels, given the kind of divides we're seeing between the US on one side, particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine.
I think the issue is really a little wider than that. Real problem for the world is that the United Nations, which was the primary platform in which people met, resolved international issues with a certain degree of flexibility between the countries, and in which, in fact, other countries could play a role of bridging the gap between, say, for a long time during the Cold War, that between the United States-led NATO bloc and the Soviet Union led leading the other socialist countries. This was really the conflict that raged along the world, but primarily in Europe. And that platform of the United Nations has been made virtually defunct because the United States and its allies, this is what they're calling now the G7 and the rule-based international order, that is not really looking at international law or United Nations. It is looking to unilaterally lay down what should be the norms of behavior other countries should follow. Doesn't apply to them because, as you saw, in this period, the United States has invaded Iraq along with some of its allies and more allies in Afghanistan. So given that they have not sought sanction from the United Nations, the fact that they are able to lay down the international law as they see it, unilaterally, as G7, as you know, again, G7 is really United States, others follow whatever the lead the United States gives. This has become a problem for most of the world. It has come to really a focus because of the Ukraine war, in which the US and its allies levied sanctions on Russia, which other countries did not follow. So the space has now opened up for other groupings. So SCO is only one of the groupings. There is the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization did not start with anything beyond trade at one point. BRICS saw itself as a more of a global focus, both in terms of money and in terms of trade, but really focused on more on trade issues at that point of time. Remember, it was really the WTO as a background.
Yeah.
Now, all of that order has gone because the WTO has, for all practical purposes, has become defunct because the United States has sanctioned 1/3 of the world without referring to United Nations or international law. And certainly, it would violate lots of the WTO provisions. So they have also seen to it that the appellate body in WTO doesn't exist. So its writ does not really run across the world. So it's an abandoning of WTO and the United Nations, the two institutions where people do participate as equals, abandoning them for the G7-based diktat of what they're calling as the international order, which again, the rule-based international order, but they get to make all the rules. So given
and
this,
also then break them whenever they like.
Yeah, and given this, I think groupings like SCO and BRICS are coming up. There is West Asia, you have the Arab states coming together, so which has been ongoing for a long time. Latin America, there are states coming together. So all of this indicate the vacuum that exists because the United Nations is not playing its role and it's not being allowed to play its role. And therefore, what do we do? So these are all the things that are happening. Increasingly, the US writ is not running in the world, and the G7, therefore, finds itself at a loss what to do. And this is in the interregnum, as it were. You have all these groupings coming up, and I think these are only going to grow.
You brought up the UN and not being able to do its job, allowed to do its job, Prabir. You brought up Afghanistan as well. These are two at least critical issues at this point that I think would have come up for discussion at the SCO. And so many countries from the region participating in it. We also, however, did see, because there are existing sort of issues between India and Pakistan, India and China as well. So, do you see this framework as a place where these bilateral differences can be put aside in the sort of larger interests of regional cooperation and finding solutions to wider regional issues that perhaps have an impact more on these member countries than they do on the United States, for example?
You know, the problem that countries like India, Pakistan, and even China have, that external issues are closely connected also to internal issues, particularly in the case of Pakistan and India. Coming together for both, settling the Kashmir issue would have been in the interest of both the countries, and both the countries realize it. Given the internal politics of each of the countries, whoever wants to settle the issue, whoever the political opponents there would do a one-upmanship and say selling the country out, and it becomes very emotive, cannot be handled. So this is the problem of history, that India and Pakistan are joined by geography, but divided by history. And this is something that therefore makes it so difficult for a political settlement to come between the two countries. At the moment, Pakistan is unstable. It's basically running, it has replaced their existing Prime Minister, Imran Khan, by what will be called a constitutional coup backed by the military. So there's a lot of unsettled issues in Pakistan apart from its economic crisis, which is really something to worry about, because a failed nuclear state on our borders is also not helpful for India. China and India have an issue with the border. That's a long-standing issue. It's not of today. And again, negotiating for India, the border issue is as much internal politics as it is external politics. And I presume that's true for China as well. So both sides have let this go on for a long time. I'm not going to pass judgments on either at this instance, in this particular case, because today we're really talking the SCO. But India's problem in SCO has been its two closest neighbors, apart from Bangladesh, China and Pakistan, have issues with India, and SCO is not the platform for them. but it is also the platform where these issues do tend to get aired. And if India was going to head the SCO meeting, helming the SCO meeting because it was the chair of the meeting, because it's being held in Goa, as you said, it left a little bit of a bad taste at the end of it. The way Indian foreign minister and the Pakistan foreign minister really made various statements. And it's not helpful to the process of peace. Anyway, it's a sideshow as far as SCO is concerned. And I think for SCO grouping, as of now, it's not clear what is the purpose of SCO. BRICS, what's the purpose of BRICS? Both of them, I think, at the moment are more in terms of developing trade and economic relationships, because the dividing line in the world is sanctions and dollar being used, being weaponized by the United States for sanctions. As I said, 1/3 of the countries and probably 60% of the world's population is under US sanctions. And if that is so, then we have a problem. If dollar becomes the globe's reserve currency, which at the moment it is. So all countries are trying to see how to work around it. And I think in that context, what economic world order emerges out of it will also determine what is the political and the military world that emerges out of it, because which will lead which? Will military lead the economics, or economics will lead the military geostrategic issues, and how will it politically reflect? These are the questions, I think, which we are going to grapple with, at least for the next 10, 15, 20 years.
20 years, yeah. Thanks very much, Praveer, for that today. And continuing sort of on a similar theme of alliances as well as relations between various nations and the focus on Asia on this episode of the Daily Debrief, we're talking next to Anish, who covers the region for People's Dispatch, about the meeting between Fumio Kishida of Japan and Yoon Suk Yeol of South Korea. It's an important meeting for both sides, both from a foreign policy perspective or a diplomacy perspective, as well as a domestic political perspective. There are, of course, historic ties. Japan has a colonial history in South Korea of over 35 years, up to 1945. Much of that actually baggage still needs to be addressed. Anish has been, of course, looking at that summit and will bring us the highlights. Anish, first up, welcome to the show, of course. As always, it's good to have you here. First up, Kishida in South Korea, how was he received? Of course, there is history that comes with it. There's baggage that comes with it. Japan has a history of colonial era atrocities in South Korea, for which it has not, I suppose, successfully made amends yet in any way. And this statement also acknowledging that history exists, but not really taking the conversation very much further from there.
Yeah, so Kishida's statement, we need to understand, does not really ruffle the status quo when it comes to the Japanese side. Now, he does not mention atrocities. He does not mention any kind. What he talks about is like people going through hard times, and which is not really an admission of anything. It is pretty much the kind of official stand that Japan has maintained since the 1960s, when it it signed this treaty with South Korea and gave certain aid and loans at the time for its industries to grow in the name of compensating for the occupation. So while the Japanese official position has always been that obviously it has occupied another country, so and it is sorry for that, but it does not admit to anything. Any kind of atrocities that have happened in these countries. And it's not just when it comes to South Korea or Korea as a whole, but also when it comes to, say, China, Philippines, and Southeast Asian nations, where Japan has committed several atrocities. Now, the lack of admission apart, the fact that he made the statement is something that shows how strong sentiments about Japan's history is with Korea in South Korea as well. We can talk about how it was received, the fact that a lot of people see very clearly through the fact that there is almost nothing, there's no substance in that statement, but the fact that it was only made because there was this popular outcry about Japan refusing to admit to its own colonial baggage, and a past that is filled with several kinds of atrocities. We're talking about forced labor, essentially, enforced slavery on a whole section of thousands of people. Another set of crimes would be the whole comfort woman thing, where women, even minors, were forced into sexual abuse by Japanese soldiers during the Second World War. Now, all of these are, and apart from these, there were several other issues at the time. None of these were ever reckoned with, and this is something that a lot of Koreans, most Koreans, actually feel is a grave injustice, and many Koreans do support the 2018 court judgment that actually recognizes Japan's liability, the continued liability to the victims of forced labor, and not only seeks compensation from Japan, but also seeks apology from it. And so this is something that even the South Korean government cannot brush aside, even despite the kind of compromise it has done with the deal for forced labor victims. So, and this is all happening despite very friendly relations happening between two conservative governments. So that shows the power of social movements right now in South Korea.
The other ever-present elephant in the room, of course, is the United States, with whom now potentially tripartite talks are also on the cards, on the sidelines of the upcoming G7 summit in Hiroshima, Anish, to which I believe Kishida has officially extended an invite to his South Korean counterpart.
Yeah, so we're not sure what kind of what will be the nature of the meeting, but this is pretty much an essential a part of US and its allies in the region trying to shore up support, and obviously show a sort of make a show of strength to the world of the kind of allies that it has in the region. We have to remember, all at the same time, we saw a South Korean government, the defense ministry, talking about participating in multilateral WMD exercises, which clearly shows that South Korea is now more and more open to maybe not just the nuclear weapons being deployed into the Korean Peninsula, but also maybe other sorts of weapons of mass destruction in the region. And obviously, Japan will be one of the partners for this multinational exercises with WMDs. Now, this is something that previously would have been, even under a conservative government, would have been thought of as a red line in South Korea, but we are at a point where clearly the current government does not see any of these conventional red lines when it comes to the very tenuous peace that exists in the Korean Peninsula, and that clearly shows that the Yoon government is ready to risk provocations at this point for in the name of nationalism or whatever, when it comes to North Korea and maybe even China. Being part of that, nevertheless, there are definitely national issues that Yoon was not able to set aside. One of the most important, significant thing is where he talks about the Fukushima wastewater that Japan plans to release this year. We should remember, we talked about this in the show, when the Pacific nations and China were raising their voices against the release of the wastewater, and also called for transparency in the whole process. South Korea was very eerily silent at the time, even though it will also be affected by the whole issue. Now it is talking about that with Kishida. So we do not know what kind of things they will achieve with that, but definitely this shows that real national issues are something that they somehow cannot overlook, even when they try to create a very compromised position in the name of allyship.
And also, what you've given us is a sense of how things might proceed, Anish, because we were talking previously with Prabir in the context of the SCO, of how a multipolar world order might look, and whether it will be trade and economics that will be the drivers of things, or whether militarism that is being pushed by the United States and its allies, but particularly in East Asia at this point, might determine how things go. So thanks for also adding a little bit to that part of the conversation, and we'll see you again on the show very soon. That's all we have for you on this episode of the Daily Debrief. As always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on all of these stories, as well as all of the other work we do from various parts of the world. We also encourage you to give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice, where you can get in touch with us, get updates about our work, and also share the stories that we cover. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode, same time, same place. Until then, stay safe. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.